thank you for coming to this session, Putting the Past on Trial, Burning Dead Witches. I'm Claire Fox, the Director of the Institute of Ideas. To those of you who don't know me, and just to say that we conceived of this session really particularly in the wake of the Jimmy Savile sex scandal originally, just in terms of the way that that was discussed. And I remember it was breaking and in the news this time last year, and we actually had a hot off the press session on it. But one of the things that's unravelled, not just in relation to that, over the discussion, has been the concept of the bad old days, a real kind of dredging up of the past, and on occasion, a witch hunt-like atmosphere. And we at least wanted to consider that at this year's festival. We also wanted to consider the fact that in the discussion around particularly sexual abuse, but it's not at all confined to it, the idea that things that have happened to you as an individual in the past, you will never get over, will define you forevermore. So there's kind of two different themes there. And I just wanted to quote the Geoffrey Wheatcroft quote from the long blurb, in case people haven't read it, which is, "If there is any hope at all, it must be that our crappy generation can slink away in shame and let in a young generation to see if they can manage things better." And that seemed to me to sum up a certain mood, which was everything that has been rubbish. And we want to examine whether that's true, consider some of those self-loathing kind of statements from older generations, look at this concept of the awfulness of the past and what impact that has for our understanding of history, which obviously is very important. We're going to first hear from Jenny Bristow, who is a writer on parenting culture and intergenerational relations, the author of Standing Up to Super Nanny, which if you haven't read, you should read, the co-author of License to Hug, How Child Protection Policies Are Poisoning the Relationships Between Generations, and also the co-author of The Social Cost of Litigation. She's an associate of the Centre for Parenting Culture Studies at the University of Kent, where she's studying the sociology of generations. Can we give her a warm welcome, please? Next up will be Alan Massey, a novelist, a journalist, a bit of an all-round Renaissance man, author of many books, 30 books, including 20 historical novels, one of which I am reading at the moment. He's one of the few people that I have the embarrassing thing of, I read one of his novels and sent him a fan email, can you imagine? Which he took rather with some grace, but that was because I was so enthusiastic. Gore Vidal said he is the master of the long ago historical novel. There's lots of things to say about him. He's been a political columnist for The Scotsman, The Daily Telegraph, The Sunday Times. He's a literary columnist for The Spectator. Got a CBE in the 2013 birthday honours list for service to literature. I've asked him so many times to speak at this festival, and he's always said no. He's just admitted that in the end he just got embarrassed and said yes. We're delighted to have you here, Alan. Hooray! Next up will be John Waters at the end, who's returning for the second year, columnist at the Irish Times, the Irish Mail on Sunday, the Irish Catholic, and Traces, the International Catholic magazine. The author of Feckers, I just like saying that. Was It For This? Why Ireland Lost the Plot, Lapsed Agnostic, and many more. He specialises in raising unpopular issues, but of public importance. And those of you who heard him speak last year will know that that's indeed what he does. He has raised issues in relation to the repression of famine memories, on the denial of rights to fathers. He's an author, a playwright, and a songwriter. In May 2013, he spoke alongside, wait for this, Pope Francis to an audience of 200,000 in St. Peter's Square. I mean, you know, how can we beat it? But actually, we're going to be better. Can we welcome him back, please? And last but not least, of course, is Professor Sir Simon Wesley, who's already been discussing cheating in sport. He also was thrashed in the best film balloon debate. Or he came second.
That's outrageous.
You lost. take it. He's the chair of the head of the Department of Psychological Medicine at the Institute of Psychiatry, King's College London, and in fact we've been doing a whole series of debates related to and in association with the Institute of Psychiatry, and we did a battle satellite there last week, which had hundreds of people, and we had to turn people away. He's academic dean for academic psychiatry, honorary consultant advisor in psychiatry to the British Army, director of King's Centre for Military Health and Research, and he researches the grey areas between medicine and psychiatry, and is noted for his work on post-traumatic stress, terrorism, shell shock, chronic fatigue syndrome, amongst other things. He's written over 600 papers, but even though he's a well-renowned academic, he's also very keen on public engagement, and that's obviously in many ways why we know him. And he lists his interest in who's who. His favourite activity is arguing in cafes, and arguing he does all the time. Can we welcome Simon Wesley, please? Jenny, kick us off, please. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. So I've spent the past few years researching the problem of generations, which is essentially the problem of society's relationship between the past, the present and the future. And the form this problem often takes at the moment, and what my research focuses on, is why it is that the generation known as the baby boomers seem to be blamed for everything that's wrong with the world in 2013. This is everything from the economic crisis to young people's apparent inability to grow up. And this is apparently because the boomers have stolen all the jobs and houses, but worse than that, on a more psychological level, because they've become a generation of helicopter parents who hover over their children and stop them from striking out alone. And what I've discovered in this research, amongst other things, is a kind of a curious finding, which is that the generational question has always involved a critique of the old ways. From Turgenev's famous 19th century novel Fathers and Sons to the brash assertion of youth in the 60s, never trust anyone over 30. There's always been a kind of rebellion against the past. But this critique of the past was largely based in a desire to transcend the past. It contained within it a vision of the future, however imperfect or one-sided that vision may have been. Today it seems a bit different. We seem to be constantly at war with the past, even the very recent past. So part of the problem with the baby boomers, for example, is seen to be the way that they represent everything that was wrong with the 60s, up to and including Jimmy Savile. But while we're constantly at war with the past, there doesn't seem to be any sense of future orientation within that critique. Rather, what you get is a strong sentiment of fatalism, the idea that the recent past has made us what we are now, and we can't transcend it, all we can do is to suffer it. That fatalism is expressed in various ways. I mean, one of the kind of ongoing, recurring themes that I'm preoccupied with is the idea that today's generation is going to be so much worse off than previous generations. It's now taken as an article of faith. I mean, you seem to read it, some new study every 2 months, making this point. And there doesn't seem to be any thought that things actually might change over the course of the younger generation now, let alone that the younger generation now might have any control over shaping their life circumstances. And that seems to me to be based on a strangely pre-modern idea that the past determines and continues to determine what we are today. There's a sort of sense that all the good stuff has been used up, just leaving us to live out the consequences in a grim and miserable fashion. Or, summed up quite nicely in the words of Government Minister David Willetts in his book, I mean, the title says it all really, The Pinch, How the Baby Boomers Took Their Children's Future and Why They Should Give It Back. And he makes the point, his central thesis of this book is that younger generations have been left to clear up the mess, and that's the phrase he uses, clear up the mess left by their parents who threw this big party without any regard to the consequences. An even pithier summary of the extent to which the past is seen to determine what we are now is given by the journalist Sarah Vine, who again is talking about the boomers. She says, not only were they economically blessed, affordable housing, low energy costs, free university education, fluid economies, they also had some of the most hedonistic and uncomplicated fun since the Romans, all the sex, the best music, all the easy idealism of privilege. Now, I just want to end with a couple of questions. First of all, even if you accept that it's possible for natural and economic resources to be used up, which actually I don't, but you know, a lot of people do think that. Even if you accept that, how is it possible to use up all the sex? You know, fun, music, idealism. I mean, surely all of these things are things that each generation makes anew. Obviously, you know, that's why you get generations, because people have sex. I mean, you get this kind of real sense that it's possible to use up these resources that are now considered finite, which never in the past would have been considered finite. And when it comes to idealism, I find it particularly interesting, because historically, difficult circumstances have often been seen as the precondition for idealism. And you know, providing the spur for people to want to bring about change. So why should that be out of the question now? Why should it be that, you know, because things are difficult, that means that people can't think about the future anymore? And my second question, which I think really kind of, you know, to me is the hub of this whole debate, is what does it say about the younger generation's relationship with the future if it's believed that it's already been lived out by their parents?
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny. Very provocative and interesting start. Plenty to pursue there when we go over to the discussion. But Alan.
Well, thank you, Claire. When Claire invited me to do this, I took it rather literally. Burning dead witches. And I assumed we were going to be invited to discuss whether we should apologize for the past. I mean, you know, put these witch finders of the 16th and 17th centuries in the stocks, which is a rather pointless activity, I think. The past has its own integrity and ought to be respected as such. You know, if you had, and I think he did actually, he certainly talked of it, you had Tony Blair apologizing for the Irish potato famine. That struck me as the height of absurdity. He hasn't, of course, apologized for Iraq, but then he thinks there is no need for apologize for Iraq. Parent and intergenerational conflict has been with us probably since Cain and Abel were born, if they ever were born. It's natural, I think, for one generation to think that the previous generation has made a mistake. I mean, I was brought up in a generation which believed that to have been let in for an appalling war, we were children at the time, because of the attitude, the appeasement policies of the government in the 1930s. In the 60s, the young people were blaming their parents in just the same way as some are now. So I think you have to accept that there will always be a certain possibility of resentment. But I think it is more interesting to look at some of these other questions, one of which Claire raised, the matter of responsibility for the past. I mean, she mentioned the Jimmy Savile case, and there are others like it at the moment. Who is responsible? Obviously, perpetrators themselves, but now we have the question of collusion, people who were said to have protected these people, some of whom who colluded were probably ignorant, others uncertain as to how they should act in difficult situations. And that seems to be one of the things that we should remember. Again, when these things, there is the question, I mean, some countries with, I would say, a more civilized code of law than Britain have statutes of limitations. They recognize, that is to say, that people change, and that somebody of 60, let us say, may not be responsible for his actions when he was 20. I can think of some of my actions when I was 20 that I would rather, certainly, nobody's considered me responsible for now. The question of apologies come up. I mean, I'm now 75, and I've done quite enough bad things in my life to not to apologize for anybody else's bad things. So I think one ought to consider the question of the statute of limitations on such matters. And I'm very worried often about these holding other people responsible. Some of the novels I've written and the series of crime novels that I'm writing just now, which are set in Bordeaux during the Second World War, deal with questions of guilt. How did people react to the German occupation of France? Now, the last one I'm going to write will deal with 1944 and the liberation, which was fine, and what the French called the épuration, the purge of those who had collaborated. Now, that was a very interesting example of shifting moral responsibility. because in fact, almost everybody in France collaborated to some extent because there was no chance to do anything else. If your country is occupied by a foreign power, you have to collaborate just to get through daily life. But of course, in 1944, when France was liberated, people who had collaborated were very quick to jump on people who they thought had collaborated more obviously. And some of the people, the victims, were no doubt deserved it. But you had, for instance, women who had slept with German soldiers, had their head shaved, were paraded through the streets and abused. Some of them had loved the Germans that they had slept with. Others were prostitutes who were collaborating. It was called horizontal collaboration. They were collaborating with the Germans in effect in exactly the same way as everybody who had anything to sell was collaborating with the Germans. Now, this shifting of moral responsibility seems to me a very unpleasant and dangerous thing. I mean, I'm enough of an individualist to believe that you have responsibility for your own actions. You have some responsibility for the consequences of your actions, what other people do as a result of it. But you have very little responsibility for things remote from yourself. And when I find people apologizing for the actions of other people, as if we are all guilty, I think of this as a piece of self-indulgence. To apologize for something that you haven't done is to make yourself feel good at the expense of truth. When I think of it, and since John is here, he will be interesting to this. I think of this sort of attitude thing of self-indulgence. I think it in a sort of, if you like, a sort of parallel piece of thinking. I think of something that Conor Cruise O'Brien said about the Irish language. And Conor was an Irish speaker, but he said, to hold a language that you don't actually use in high regard, while holding the one that you do actually use, that is to say English, in low regard, is to be in a powerless moral condition. Now, I think if you are apologizing for the actions of other people, you are in danger of being in a powerless moral condition as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Alan. I think that shifting moral responsibility is something I do want to explore in the different ways it plays itself out as well in the discussion. So, John, your thoughts?
Yeah, I hope we get back to that because it's very interesting, but I wanted to set up my thing first. It's the ideology stupid, or it's the ideology idiot. I don't mean that as a criticism, or I don't mean the word, it's just a cheap line, really. It's just a cheap headline. I did a sub-editing course once and I never got over it, so that's all that is. But it is about the ideology. All of this stuff in the present is really about the present. It's not about the past, really. It's an attempt to do something in the present, to achieve something, in using these figures which are plucked from the past in order to manipulate what's going on now by demonizing certain qualities. It's not the people. The people are expendable in a certain sense. You know, Jimmy Savile is expendable. I mean, he's just a dupe in this whole cultural war. And as are David Tavis, all these other guys, you know. And it's very interesting to look at the variations in the treatment of various people, like, say, Pete Townsend, as opposed to the others. You know, because why? Because The Who are still culturally useful as a band. I mean, they played in the Olympics last year. They're still useful as a cultural icon. The Beatles, the Stones, and The Who are that triumvirate of important cultural icons in the culture of. So it's about freedom in a way. This is all about freedom. I started to see this first about 20 years ago when I'd be in debates in Ireland about things. And you'd be talking about something that you thought was very straightforward about, say, crime. Why crime was on the rise, why murder was on the rise, and so on. And you'd be in these debates, and suddenly you'd be talking about something different. You'd be talking about corporal punishment in the 1950s, or you'd be talking about the record of the Catholic Church in some kind, and you say, what's the connection here? And the connection is this is a way of trumping you with an argument that sort of wipes out the fact that you're trying to make a clear argument that the past was, in a certain sense, in a particular category, preferable, better. You're not saying overwhelmingly or all the time, but just on this particular thing, it was better. But you're not allowed to say that, because then you actually you're valuing the values of the past in some way, and that's a dangerous thing to do in the present until they've been stamped by the establishment of the present. Now, I saw this also with in relation to, we had this big time in Ireland the last 30, 40 years where we had these kind of what I call scapegoats. De Valera, our was kind of not so much our Churchill as our de Gaulle, and we had John Charles McQuaid, who was the Archbishop of Dublin. These became like demonic figures in the past 25, 30 years. And even, it's very interesting to look. I mean, there's one speech which De Valera made as Prime Minister, Taoiseach, in 1943, where he spoke about, it's called the Comely Maidens Dancing at the Crossroads speech, and it is caricatured in modern Ireland, culturally, in these terms. And it's very interesting to look at it, because it's the caricature of the idea of a Gaelic Ireland, of a rural landscape, of affection for those fundamental things, right? But actually, when you look at the speech, he doesn't use the word comely, he doesn't use the word crossroads, and he doesn't mention dancing at all. And yet this is what is remembered in the culture. Why? Because this caricature is necessary to use the speech in this particular way in order to demonize all the more. It's a necessary element. So you need to kind of make the past look worse than it even was, and everybody's already prepared to believe that it was terrible, but you make it even worse. So that's one thing about it. You have to actually then look at the people who are being scapegoated. And you find universally they always are the least useful people. I mean, they're kind of cultural eunuchs by the time they get done. The Catholic priests or BBC disc jockeys of the 1960s. They have that in common, that they are cultural eunuchs at this stage, and so they're useful to sacrifices. To get into the witch thing, they can be burned without cost culturally, because they're not about the freedom that we're looking for now. That freedom. And I mean, as somebody looking in from Ireland, I remember it's very interesting to see what's happening now in the UK, because I mean, as a child, my father used to bring home the Observer on a Monday with the masthead cut off. He'd get it off one of the newsagents, and the News of the World. And he'd hide away the News of the World, and you'd find it, and you'd be looking at these things about voyeuristic vicars and rampaging rectors, and this is like a different kind of place. And you say, wow, this is incredible. I want to go there one day. And it seemed to be like, compared to the Catholic Ireland that we had, now the extraordinary thing is flipping over. Like, you're going after all the rampaging rectors and the voyeuristic vicars and all these guys who were having the fun that, as we thought, are being kind of put on trial now. And the News of the World doesn't exist anymore. And I think, wow, I've lived upside down. I've been in the wrong country or something. I should have been here 40 years ago, and I should be going over there now. Because we imitate everything you do, but 30 years later. So I've just got about enough time to live out the 60s if I stay where I am. So there's all that stuff it's very interesting to look at. So it's about the ideology. It's about what we want to achieve, and it's about freedom. And the interesting thing is, I mean, I would make an argument in another context that freedom is not real freedom. That it is but that is not being admitted. That is not what it's about. I mean, in a sense, the ideology wants to maintain the version of freedom and yet sort of bring in a new establishment. So what you have now, instead of a kind of a religious ethic, you have a PC ethic. The rules there are no rules now other than the PC rules. There are no rules other than the ones that can get football managers for telling jokes about monkeys. There's no religious rule. There's no fundamental rule. There's no absolute rule. It's only a breach of some kind of protocol which is really invented by the new establishment. And that's where people like Savile came unstuck, really. I mean, not that, and you have to do this. You have to kind of distance yourself from Savile. Otherwise, people think you're defending everything that he did. I mean, I never was a fan of Savile, of all the people. But, I mean, David Lee Travis was harmless. I liked The Who, but not as much as the Beatles. John Peel. They almost came after Peel there a couple of years ago. It kind of died down again, didn't it? And I'm sure they could get him on something if they wanted to. But in a strange, he's so iconic in the culture that nobody wants to go after him. And the amazing thing is, it's not about where you stand on the ideology. You find that actually this happens all the time in every era, and that the establishment is always part of the purge. The establishment of the police, the judiciary, everybody can be summoned to the cause by the culture. And it's an amazing thing to observe. So it's not about what you believe, whether you're right-wing or left-wing, whether you like pop music or not, whether you like sex or not, whether you're a rector or a vicar or what you are. It's just not about that. It's about the time, that this is the way we actually need to move forward. We need to savage the past, cut all the wires from the past, cut the wires of tradition and wisdom and knowledge and all that stuff, memory, and create a new freedom, a new republic of freedom in the present.
Thank you very much. Rampaging rectors in Don't Take Offence. Simon.
You just reminded me, my uncle-in-law was the papal nuncio in Ireland in the 80s, and we went to stay with him. And it was the time of the great Bishop Casey scandal. Do you remember the bonking bishop of Galway? And he'd gone into hiding and nobody knew where he was. Well, we knew where he was because he was in the nuncio. And we used to come down for breakfast and he was hiding behind the curtains. and then he would try and go across to get coffee and he would crawl along the floor so he couldn't be seen in case there were any long lens photographers outside the window. And now I can now reveal for history that's where he was. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant. It's completely irrelevant to everything I'm going to say, actually, but you just reminded me of this story of my early life.
I'm going to use that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now then, so you're going to have to find out for the next 4 years, there's a rule of public life and public speeches that every single speech and every event will have some mention of the First World War. So you might as well just get used to it because that's what's going to happen for the next 4 years. Indeed, it's the next session in this room. It's going to be about the First World War. So I want to start and indeed finish with the First World War, but because it relates very much to this issue of our rewriting history and blaming, well, apologizing for a past in which we actually had no particular relevance. I mean, you called it self-indulgence. I would call it more like contrition chic. It's a pleasure that we get for apologizing for things that are nothing to do with us, and we played no part to make us feel better. And I played a part in a big legal case a couple of years ago. I was representing the Ministry of Defence, and it was the judicial review of what was called the pardons campaign. It was a particularly big public campaign to pardon one man, a man called Private Harry Farr, who had been executed for cowardice in 1916. And the movement was about that he should be pardoned for the offence, and opprobrium should be brought to bear on those around him who had convicted him and indeed executed him in 1916. Now, I'm not going to go into the rights and wrongs of the case and what actually happened and all that kind of stuff, although fascinating though it is. It's about really the point of it all, because I would suggest to you there was really no point at all. Had the man been pardoned in 1920, when his actions indeed carried moral opprobrium and shame, that would have actually meant something. It would have meant something to his spirit, certainly meant something to his family, and much else. But by now, of course, all those battles have long since gone. There was nothing much that we would learn or gain or from this at all. We've had now Owen, we've had Oh, What a Lovely War, Blackadder, etc. There's even a book called Private Peaceful, which is on the standard reading list for every primary school, which is entirely based on this case. So Harry Farr had already been rehabilitated many times over, and indeed he'd become a cultural hero of his own. And speaking at a big public school, as I was recently, I asked the people in the school if they knew the name of Harry Farr. Half of them did, half of them didn't. But then I asked them if they knew the name of any person who'd won the Victoria Cross. And they'd been in the school hall for 7 years. I mean, obviously, no, they'd gone home. They hadn't been there for 7 years, clearly not. But they'd been at the school for 7 years, you know what I mean? And behind them was a board with 22 names on of Victoria Cross winners. And they're telling you can't turn around, that's cheating, which is bad. And in fact, not a single one could name anybody who'd won the VC at all. So the battle as to who are the cultural heroes now had long since been gone, and we'd moved on. Apologising for it, there's no chance of us going back there. There's no chance of resuming the death penalty in any shape or form, which is good, let alone for military offences. So it's a bit like apologising as Blair also, I think it was Blair. Was it Blair who apologised for slavery? Who was it? It was, okay. I mean, there is not even the most raving UKIP member believes that we could bring back the Atlantic slave trade. Okay, well, at least I assume they don't. I haven't actually read their manifesto, but perhaps they do. But I'm assuming that they don't. So, in other words, it's not just that it's fatuous and meaningless, it's also rather smug. Yes. Okay, it puts us gives us a kind of moral superiority over a period of history in which we are in absolutely no position to judge. We really are not capable of comprehending, perhaps thank God, what had happened to that particular man in 1916, or the reasons as to why the events had gone the way they had. You said the past has its own integrity, I think, Helen. I think that's a very good point. And we also have no reason at all to have this sense of moral superiority, this chic that came from the way that we were describing it. And indeed, you might say of all the things in the world for us not to feel particularly smug about, it would be the treatment of mental illness in our current society as well. That's not an area which we can take massive pride. So I would suggest then there's a huge difference then between that kind of apology that I'm complaining about, but I don't know if you'd agree with me on Alan, but you know, where it actually is meaningful, when Chirac apologizes in July 1995 for the collaboration of this history and the treatment of the Jews, I don't know, but I would suggest that actually was meaningful because that issue was very much alive. You know, the past had certainly not passed, and there was, you know, by this time, there was still a massive debate going on, and that was an action, even though Chirac was not responsible for it. He was not in Vichy, was it? That's Mitterrand.
Yes.
Yeah.
Chat.
All right, but anyway, the point is, there you have at least some reason where an apology made with true contrition actually can take a subject forward and can lead to other events that are necessary. But on the whole, I would suggest these are just sentimental nonsense and do not help in any way an understanding of history.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
You got a spontaneous applause.
Right, okay, I wanted to actually come back to something, though, that Jenny said, which is slightly different. I think that say, for example, you've written a lot on parenting, Jenny. One of the things that drives me mad is this idea that all parents have got to learn new parenting techniques, which the only inference there is that all old parents had rubbish parenting techniques, if you see what I mean. But it is this idea that seems to me to be relatively new, which is just that, I don't know, that everything in the recent past was wrong. We did it all wrong. We've got to relearn. Does that resonate with people in terms of what Jenny said? Is the bad old days but stuck in the present, but with no sense of the future, and not very revolutionary, but it really is a demonisation of the past?
That resonates very much with me. I mean, you know, first of all, there's this issue of the cult of the expert. You know, there's always an expert, a new generation of experts, and there's a new generation of expertise, and we are all subject to it. And this is real in the area of family life because, you know, it's increasingly going to be enforced upon family, which as the state encroaches more and more on family. You know, this is part of the ideological program, you know, that I see as being problematic because, you know, we're actually child abuse is being used as a lever because it's such a, you know, it fills us with horror, and rightly so, which you have to say, and of course it does, but you still have to say it, and of course it is right that you should say it, but you still have to say it, but so it's a lever to actually force us into this particular new shape, and it's very scary because it means that most of us then agree with the encroachment. We agree with the idea that the social worker should have the right to get a policeman to break your door down and take your child if somebody says that you have broken one of the rules. And that's the fundamental change in our culture, that we don't seem to be alert to, and we don't seem to have a mechanism. And I found interesting, in Ireland and in the UK, liberal newspapers seem to go along with this. I haven't quite got to the bottom of why, but for example, liberal media tend to side with the state, with the fascists on this issue, whereas they would be opposed to the fascists on almost everything else. And I find that interesting. It's part of this whole thing. It has to do with child abuse in different ways. I mean, child abuse is a very interesting thing because it's almost like the worst thing. It's worse than murder, culturally. I'm not saying it isn't, by the way. You know, it is, and it's unforgivable. It's unforgivable. That's the interesting thing. I mean, we've lost a religious thing, so it's unforgivable. You can't ever, I mean, you can't apologize. Talking about apologies, this is the one thing you cannot apologize for. Nobody can apologize because no apology is sufficient. It's always too little, too late, or it's mealy-mouthed, or it's, you know, equivocal, or so it's the perfect instrument for people who want to change reality and change people's minds and change people's emotions and change what people will accept in a culture.
Just going to you, Jenny, because one of the things that John said was this is about the present and not about the past, but it takes the form of a kind of trawling through the past. And we had a session yesterday on the sort of sex abuse scandals in music schools and one-to-one tuition and things like that. But I was very struck that it didn't matter what anyone said, it was not going to be enough for those people who wanted to say, do you know what it was like then? If you see what I mean. But then they were demanding now, but there was nothing you could do now, apart from to keep saying how awful it was, if you see what I mean. So, but do you recognise something in that?
I do. I mean, I think John's right in that, it is about the present, not the past. I mean, I think that's true. But what interests me is that is where does it go from there? You know, there's nothing that comes out of it. I mean, I think this is what you're saying, Claire, that, you know, the only kind of action then is the kind of obsessing on the past rather than this kind of notion of what you might do differently. And I mean, the reason why I wanted to talk about the baby boomers rather than Jimmy Savile, to be honest, is because I think it is, you know, as you were saying, we can all agree that Jimmy Savile was a creep, right? And he's dead. What's interesting is that the kind of partly what gave that saga such oomph is the extent to which it represents that cultural moment that everybody wants to critique. And the interesting thing about the baby boomer generation as a whole is that they're not dead. You know, they'll be alive for a very long time. That's apparently part of the problem with them. And they're by and large nice people. They're not Jimmy Savile. And they're all apologising for themselves. I mean, this is the bizarre thing, and this is what I think is different to generational conflict, certainly, you know, as it's been seen over the 19th and 20th century, in the sense that it's actually being led by the very people who, yeah, they kind of want to overthrow themselves in a very strange way. And that's the thing, that it's not future-orientated, this discussion we have at the moment. It's a sort of, it's stuck in the present, and orientated around kind of going over the past again and again and again.
Alan, I just wanted to, again, something we started the blurb with was when David Cameron, talking about racism in football, he was denouncing, he says, "We will not let recent events drag us back to the bad old days of the past." It's obviously a ridiculous statement, but I mean, that sort of sums it up, because even your Vichy France, I mean, that's the kind of, the major traumas, at least there's something going on there. But basically what we're talking about now is minor incidents in football become this kind of script through which everybody goes, at least we're not like that. Or do you recognise something of that, or what's going on?
I think that was probably a pretty silly, off-the-cuff remark, going back to the bad old days of the past. I mean, obviously, yes, and what it means is that, you know, people were more racist in the past than they are now, which is perfectly true. One reason they were more racist in the past than they are now, of course, is that it was quite possible to grow up in Britain and into middle age and meet nobody of colour. So the people who were different were more different. And that is one reason for religious prejudice, or racist prejudice, and indeed religious prejudice often. One of the things when you were saying about the child abuse, of course, is that we do actually want to have it both ways. And I'm saying two or two things. I mean, first of all, Jimmy Savile is a product, and made his way he lived made possible by what we supposedly admire in the 60s, the youth revolution, the Beatles and so on. I mean, he is part of that culture. And what we want to keep is the nice side of it, and not admit to the nasty side, perhaps. It is much the same as at present, when we talk about child abuse being the worst thing, and it's a very bad thing, obviously. If social workers take children away from parents, there is an outcry, because this is the state behaving in this fascist way. If they don't take children away from parents, there is an outcry, because they have failed to behave in a fascist way. But then we have to admit, if we're honest, that most of us, much of the time, live by double standards. I mean, that is part of being human, I'm afraid.
Simon, reflect on any of this, but I also wanted to ask you about the thing that I was just saying, just so I can just, before I go out to the audience, this thing about you, individuals, whatever about living by double standards, also this idea of the trauma of the past affecting you as the individual, and that script of the moment.
Well, I would like to start with an apology, and I would like to apologise for the behaviour of Alan Massey when he was a 20-year-old, as he has significantly refused to do that. Now, but clearly I can't do that, can I? But, you know, how can I do that? It's not possible for me to do that, but actually that's what I've just done. So, you know, it would be, Mary Warnock said, you know, it's about as sensible as men apologising for women for denying them the vote. Although perhaps you think we should apologise, I don't know. But, you know, you can't, you know, the fact that I cannot apologise for Alan Massey proves that you can't make an apology for things that you didn't have anything to do with and which are not indeed within your gift to apologize for. The other problem with these, though, we have to also remember, we said that they serve no function. In fact, they do serve some ritual function nowadays because, of course, they lead to, because we throw these things around so much, they don't actually, they don't help the victim very much, to be honest. I don't think they always want more, etc., etc. They are part of the kind of way in which we now do acknowledge wrong, which is through the payment of compensation, where there's an actual value put on these things, and that's one of the reasons why we have these inquiries. And the Savile inquiry, by which I mean the Lord Savile inquiry for Bloody Sunday. It's a great shame that Lord Savile wasn't asked to investigate Jimmy Savile, wasn't it? Because you'd have the kind of Savile on Savile or the Savile Squared inquiry, and that would have been well, yes, that's right. Yes, that would have been quite an interesting thing, but it's part of now. Unfortunately, we've now almost monetarized apologies into something. The only way that we can now do it, in which we acknowledge that some wrong has been done, is by finally putting it into monetary terms. At the end of that, I still don't believe that anybody feels much happier about it. I'm not entirely sure that they do, but that's the way that we now move on.
Okay, look, audience, let's get the conversation going.
I'm probably being a bit unfair, but I'm just wondering how the panel would respond to the suggestion that what you're addressing is, or you need to distinguish between the contemporary, the recent past, and the distant past.
I was going to make this point, and then Alan spoke, and I thought, oh, he sounds like he's slipping here, that somehow what happens in the 60s can be equated with having sex with 8-year-olds in terms of, Jimmy Savile is a product of the 1960s. The thing that I found most terrifying in this whole discussion was actually, I think it was a discussion about John Peel, and there was a woman interviewed, and it was quite a long 15-minute, 20-minute session on Newsnight or something like that, where this woman woman who was in her 60s now, was discussing how problematic the sort of free sex had been for her, and she was sort of reliving she obviously didn't have the great sex that everyone else apparently had. But anyway, she was reimagining, or appeared to be reconstructing this time of the sort of late 60s, early 70s in a really profoundly degraded way. And the thing that terrified me about it is it was almost like the idea of freedom was being seen as dangerous and degrading, represented through this woman's reimagination of her experience.
I would like to pose a question to Jenny about this generation, let's say, conflict. It seems to me that it's just a desperate attempt of the baby boomers to ascertain their, importance in the society today, even if their role was negative. I mean, nothing more, because you don't mention no blame from the younger generation towards them, but just them, crying over their own mistakes. And the other thing is, I would wanted to say something about responsibility, because I also find it very important issue about the younger generation not taking responsibility. And for me, it sometimes seems that this is an only truly subversive thing that the younger generation can do, is to refuse to participate in the society that they are not satisfied with.
There are two different levels here. There's one level is about the individual. And I think it's very dismissive to say that it doesn't help the individual an apology because we don't know. I'm not aware that there is broad-scale research about what impact an apology, or even in a society which is everything is monetized, compensation has. So I think that's a kind of throwaway remark that doesn't really actually move the discussion forward. There is another level which is about the society and how does the memory of a community influence the future of that community. And you just had a discussion here about neuroscience and the fact that this kind of pseudoscience is influencing policy making. And I would argue, and thereby I would like to put a lot of sand into your wheels there, I would argue that looking at history and the past is a much better way to inform policy for the future than any other way. And it's actually, we have much more evidence about what happened in the past, and the benefit of the past is that you can analyze it and you can learn from it, and not in the way of an inquiry, but you can actually learn from it. And in that context, the interesting thing about Savile is not the lone lunatic. The interesting thing is about the institutions, and I do hope that many of those institutions still exist, many of those cultures still exist, and I don't know of any other way of how you can improve the culture of those institutions other than trying to understand what was in the past. So I think the past should really inform the future, and it does.
This is a question, I think, mainly for Alan. You mentioned the statute of limitations. And I just want to know, where would you put the cut-off point for the past in the statute of limitations? Like, how far back would you go? Because to say a victim of, let's say, a sexually based crime, they might not come forward for many, many years. So where would you put that cut-off point for them?
I was wondering about, you were talking about the effect of the past on the present, and the whether or not you can transcend experiences of the past, post-traumatic disorders and such like. We seem to be living in an incredibly narcissistic and self-indulgent time where everything from the misery memoir to the X Factor sob story has to be constructed on a trauma that defines you as an individual. And I'm wondering, is that not profoundly infantilizing? Have we abdicated responsibility to define ourselves in the present as opposed to assuming perpetual victimhood?
You were mentioning about possible disdain for lots of inquiries in the past, especially concerning Operation Yewtree. In that case, I wouldn't mind asking, what would you say is your solution for when justice has not been served and thus the person is still and will never be served because the person is dead? But how in that case do we achieve a semblance of closure for the victims? In that case, because it isn't just Jimmy Savile, it's historical and many more things.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting idea, this idea of closure, which is really this kind of ritual, this kind of performance that something gets resolved. But of course, the term closure has got as much intellectual or moral content as lessons will be learned. It's a rhetorical, performative accomplishment that we now totally without thought kind of repeat time and time again. My main concern is that the debate that has occurred has got two positions which are equally wrong. On the one hand, there is the argument that basically, sort of says that Jimmy Savile and all these DJs are still, influencing the way that institutions run, like that person behind, as if somehow the BBC or the NHS remotely resembles anything that happened, 20, 30 years ago. The idea is, if a child goes anywhere in a BBC building now, you will have sort of 45 guardians, sort of protecting the child from anything. I mean, it's a totally different world in that respect, and to the point at which, it is quite unpleasant the way that it's regulated, micromanaged, and nobody's trusted to do anything. So you have that argument on the one hand. On the other argument is that, which people kind of come back and they say, well, actually, the culture had changed. And many people that I've talked to are kind of, for example, sympathetic to some of the things that I've been arguing about. So yes, Frank, you're right, the culture had changed. And I've talked to people who've been involved in the inquiries of the NHS and some of the other inquiries, and they're all making the point, yes, the culture had changed. In one sense, that's true, the culture had changed, but the insidious content of the remark, the culture has changed, is the conviction that there was something horribly wrong. That, if you were a 1960s person like myself, you kind of casually went around hurting people, and you had no sense of responsibility. And that people in the 1960s and the 1970s were so out of control, so irresponsible, that those times were like, sort of like a kind of a minor version of the Holocaust with millions of victims and everything. And actually what happens when you say the culture has changed is the demonization of an era which had its very creative, transformative, creative aspects, and obviously it also had its silly downside, sort of negative aspects to it. And I do think that what we have in this discussion is a complete sense of historical amnesia, where we end up with both sides flattering ourselves in the here and now as being these uniquely sensitive and flexible people, whereas those individuals, sort of in the old culture, were by definition, sort of unable to understand, sort of how to behave, what life was really all about. And I think that we're not learning from the past here. When people ask the question, what can we learn from the past? What we're doing is we're furiously rewriting the past in accordance with our worst instinct in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a psychiatrist. That's what I do for a living. And the fact that the past shapes us in so many ways is why being a psychiatrist is such an excellent job. But it's always complex. It's very rarely defined by a single event in your life, which is what the lady was alluding to. It's a part of a process that goes on about how you were, how these things happen, what the consequences were. And it's always very ongoing, complicated, never can be reduced to a single specific thing, or hardly ever would be a better way of putting it. And one of the things you do in psychiatry, because the problem with that view of how you are is you end up believing that you yourself have been defined by something that was done to you, as opposed to yourself being defined by the person you are. And when things are going well in treatment, you will actually, people will gradually come back to this view of who they are as opposed to what was done to them. Now that's psychiatry, but if I couldn't be a psychiatrist, I'd be a historian. Because if I want to know what was it like in society, how did these happen, then you wouldn't turn to a psychiatrist or a psychologist, you would turn to a historian. And you wouldn't turn to an inquiry either. That's the task of historians, and the person who was talking about that, I thoroughly agree. I mean, that's what I would do, and that's what I would turn to, and that's the type of inquiry and scholarship that will help us understand the past, and of course it has relevance to the future, but at the moment probably more than neurosciences does. The point was made also about the recent past and the distant past. Well, I think that's relevant when we come again to where I thought we were coming from, which is the point of apologies. So apologies from the South Yorkshire Police might be meaningful to Hillsborough victims, but it must be from an apology. It must make sense. You must have played some part in the causation of the events for which you are apologising. Otherwise, it's like me apologising for Alan Massey. I think that was the point I'm making. And indeed, there are many times when we get insincere apologies. When the president of Serbia apologised to Srebrenica, and everyone said, "Oh, that was very good. That was very contrite." It's only when you found out it was actually the result of a vote in their parliament, and I think it went on 4 votes. So that's clearly not a contrite apology by a society that is actually coming to terms with what it's done. It's a piece of politics about reintegration with Europe, and that is not an apology and serves no function at all. So they have a role, but not in either a sentimental way for something that you have nothing to do with, or in a cynical way, merely to gain advantage. And that will just leave the victims feeling even more disenfranchised and even more hurt and pained.
I was interested in the person who said up there, I think, that freedom is, it makes you sound as if freedom is dangerous. Well, of course, freedom is dangerous. It's much easier to be hadden done, as we say in Scotland. But to be free to do things means making a moral choice. I mean, one comes back to the whole thing of, existentialism. There you are, there's your life, what do you make of it? And of course, if you are free to make choices, you will make some choices which are good and some which are bad. That's one thing. And the other thing one has to say when you were talking about closure and so on, is that one has to remember, individuals are different. Not everybody reacts to things in the same way. How many people in the audience have read the novels of Simon Raven? Anyone?
Yep.
Yeah.
Through Oblivion.
Yes. Now, Simon Raven was a good novelist in his early years anyway, who in one of his books of memoirs, or several of his books of memoirs and several of his novels, recounted with relish how at the age of 11 or 12 he was seduced, along with 2 or 3 other people at his prep school, by the games master. He wasn't ashamed of it. He said he had enjoyed it, and he continued to enjoy that sort of thing for the rest of his life. Very dangerous freedom. Was he a monster? Was he wrong? I don't know.
I'm very interested in what Frank was saying, because I actually don't think this is about demonizing the 60s. I think it's actually the opposite. It's a kind of a controlled explosion culturally in order to rescue the 60s and its legacy of freedom and its idea of freedom. So we offer up sacrifices to actually dispense with the cloud that's potentially there in relation to that question about freedom. Because there's a kind of a syndrome at the back of this, which I call Peter Pan syndrome, which is really about the fact that the 60s, the baby boomers took power, who wrested power in the 50s, 60s from the old grey-bearded establishment. They're still there. They have actually stunted the natural process of cyclical change has been arrested because they have refused to yield power. They've also refused to be honest about the freedom, the experience of freedom that they had. And because they have, there's this kind of contradiction now opening up, where the younger generations are pushing. They've taken on board. The younger generations haven't been permitted up because they have no new proposal, as it were. The ideal optimum version of freedom has already been put on the table, and it's as though there's nothing you can add to it. So there's no place for idealism. There's no place for new energy. And because of that, there's all these questions then that need to be dissipated and dealt with. And because of that, they have to offer up sacrifices. And Jimmy Savile is kind of almost the easiest one you can possibly find on the entire landscape. But that's why I say, you see, they will stop short. I mean, it's impossible. You can think of any figure in the rock and roll establishment of that period. They will be completely safe for as long as they live. Gary Glitter was just probably, again, somebody who was expendable. He was never a particularly, important figure culturally. But they will not allow the important cultural figures to be touched. So it's a controlled explosion that's happening now. There is no attack on the 60s, because the 60s actually at the core of this is the most important thing ideologically, that idea of freedom, and which is immune from attack elsewhere. I mean, for example, there's an possibility of criticising that freedom from, say, a Catholic position, which would be a different kind of analysis. And in a way, that's to get around that, to avoid that tackle, which might be imminent round about now.
Can I just say, you keep saying they will not allow. I have no idea who this they is.
But, well, I mean, I'm not. I think you have to acknowledge if there's going to be an establishment and a cultural establishment, there must be a they somewhere at the heart of it. There's an ideology at the heart of it. There's a view which is shared. Yeah, and ironically, the BBC was part of promulgating all of this stuff.
Right. Yes, Jenny.
Yeah, I mean, I just think the absolute opposite to John. I think. I mean, I think the problem of the 60s is precisely freedom. That is the problem that is being argued out today. And what's being articulated in this discussion is, there was this moment where all bets were off, all kinds of experimentation, and look what it got us, Jimmy Savile. Right, and this is and that's the process of the demonisation, the way that the demonisation works. And the thing is that while I agree with you on the role of these kind of dead witches in this thing, the scapegoats are still alive. That's what I was saying. They're still alive. They're still nice people. It's often the nice people talking about themselves. I've read, believe me, hundreds of mea culpas where people saying, "Oh, well, we thought this in the 60s. We were wrong. We now know we're wrong. We're really sorry for what we did. We wanted freedom. Now we realise we need constraint." And that, I think, is the way in which the recent past is being used as an argument about the present. And that's what I find actually quite worrying about it.
Okay.
About the idea of historians, I think one of the most important books about recent history of witch hunts is Richard Webster's The Secret of Bryn Estyn, which dissects exactly the dynamics by which you get these sudden cultural implosions where someone looks at the past and says it was all terribly wrong and criminal and wicked, and all manner of people then are held to account for it. So I'd urge anyone who wants to understand why we're doing what we're doing at the moment about Savile to read that book, because it's a virtual replay of what happened in the 1990s with Welsh children's care homes. And the secret of Bryn Estyn, according to Richard Webster, is that there wasn't widespread abuse. There were one or two people who were convicted, but the vast majority of people at the time were conscientious care workers looking after very troubled young people. On the issue of time limits, I have to say I'm thoroughly in agreement with Alan on that, and I'd like to propose 5th century Athens, which had a time limit of 5 years for all crimes except for homicide. Thank you.
I watched part of Sunday Morning Live, and they were actually talking about, basically they're talking because this guy called Pribka died recently, and they're trying to bury him. He was basically a Nazi, war criminal. And they were basically talking about, statute of limitations, whether it was still right for someone, to be pursued even though they were over 100. And it just struck me because also in the same programme, they showed this poster being put up by the German government, which is basically telling people that they could call this confidential hotline in which basically to turn people in and hopefully get a reward as a result of that. And what I was struck by was that rather than drawing a line under and trying to come to terms with the past, there seemed to be an attempt by the state in this instance to basically keep it going as a, well, obviously as a means to, well, for whatever reason, I'm not quite sure. But what also struck me though was that rather than drawing a line in terms of trying to deal with the past, it seems that they're using the past as a means of trying to perpetuate itself in terms of giving it a legitimacy. Someone also mentioned about the fact that the German government was constantly apologising and, for World War II, but it seems there's also a useful aspect for them to use, as a means, of basically pursuing, people who, for all they've done in the past, can no longer harm people.
Apart from the obvious fact that historical apology, which has become a cultural phenomenon, has been devalued into absurdity when we had the entire city of Bristol apologising for the slave trade, having safely banked all the money in Clifton and made sure that all the mansions were still there, now we can apologise. But is it also with historical apology that it's become a kind of, not just a meaningless healing ritual, but it's actually a cop-out? This so-called closure is basically an excuse for not making amends. And I'm thinking particularly in Australia, where you've had the serial apologies to the Aborigines, starting in the state parliaments, the Tasmania, going right around the entire country, and finally culminating in Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in a major ceremony in Canberra, apologising to all the Aborigines who hadn't already been apologised to by the states. But nothing's been actually done for their descendants.
I'm from Liverpool, and everything there is about nostalgia. So, if it's not the Beatles, it's Hillsborough, and if it's not Hillsborough, it's Thatcher, and if it's not Thatcher, it's the slave trade as well, which next month thinks Black History Month, isn't it? So, is it this month? Yeah, so that that's a big topic in Liverpool at the moment. But what I wanted to ask is, while capitalism continue to make, new material goods, in terms of culture, it's unable to. It seems to come to a point where it's unable to create anything that's new and unique. So, why is that happening?
I wonder if there's an issue here about who is to judge right or wrong, because it seems to me that's really an issue for you and me, all of us as individuals, to make up our own minds, which we're all capable of doing about things like Hillsborough, Jimmy Savile, the Mau Mau uprising, and so on and so forth. But those who campaign about those issues are never satisfied with the fact that we are able to make up our own minds. And they always want it kicked into some official arena, whether it's with an official inquiry, whether it's the passing of legislation, or whether it's some judge ruling on these matters. And that does trouble me, because it seems to me there's a real undermining of our own ability. There's no longer... People are no longer satisfied with the fact that we as individuals can make up our own minds about these issues. There has to be some seal of official approval, and I find that quite troubling.
As a number of panellists have said, and audience members, that the past is dragged into present debates about how we divide power and wealth in the current day. So, I mean, for example, the Jimmy Savile conversation had in the background a sort of conversation about the BBC and what role it has in Britain and how much power and money and influence it gets. Specifically on the baby boomers, there's a very real and valid confrontation about how Britain divides its wealth. So the example I think that sums it up is in the 60s, the average first-time home buyer was 24. A decade ago, they were 28, and it's now shot up to 37. So the problem, so this isn't just about millennials sort of bitching at their parents. This is about a system that leaves people with no stake in the economic order, and the result is kind of nihilism, from Edward Snowden to Miley Cyrus.
I'm kind of concerned by the precedent we might be setting through this by disowning the idea of apologies and by suggesting that we shouldn't be apologising for things that have passed. We're almost considering not apologising for the present as well. And I think that we're going to... Either we have to set an arbitrary boundary, which just only was mentioned 5 years. It just seems wrong to set this arbitrary boundary. And what we should be doing is owning up for what we've done wrong. And we joked about it earlier, but learning the lessons from that. And looking at what has passed and not brushing it under the carpet, but addressing it and seeing what we can do.
Hi, the first thing I wanted to say, I still don't know why we're talking about Savile. He's dead. No matter what we say or what we do, it's not going to change anything. And the second thing I wanted to say is, whether you contributed to this or not, your generation have left my generation in a nutshell. Do you not think it's your duty to advise us, help us, and educate us on not making the same mistakes that you guys made?
I think that's like depressing. I'm young, can't you sort it out for me? Do it yourself. That's the point. I've got a generational clap. I want to make a contribution, but not necessarily directly related to that, but it's sort of related, and then I'll bring the panel in. Just a couple of things just to reflect that I've been thinking while the discussion's going on. I liked Alan's comeback to somebody earlier saying freedom is dangerous, and indeed freedom is dangerous. It's risky. If people are free, they are free to do terrible things. They're free, and anything can happen. For me, that's the exciting but challenging bit of being free, and it's the thing which I most cherish about being human, that we have that freedom, because possibility is endless, but the dangers are undoubtedly immense. So I do actually disagree with you, John. I mean, I think that is the very thing that nobody wants. So the argument that I'm constantly having was there was too much freedom in the past, and we have to now regulate to ensure that these things... I mean, I know you'll come back on me, but I'm just saying that's what I... Have that argument, you'll get the last word. And so that's one thing. So I think that's one of the things that when people say we've got to learn the lessons of the past, it's inevitably there was too much freedom and we've got to have less of it. And we can't trust people, because if you trust people without regulating them, they will turn into this monster, or they'll do this terrible thing, and so on and so forth. So, you know, racism football, what do we need? We need to clamp down, monitor, you know, police, kick people out, arrest people who say the wrong thing on Twitter, even though, in fact, you know, the racist landscape in terms of football is so completely different than the past. But somehow, we've got to learn from the past, and we'll just clamp down now and so on, or we'll go back to that and they had too much freedom. And sexual violence and so on, that tends to be, it seems to me, to be one of the problems with what's happening at the moment. But the other thing is, and I really related to the point that was made about X Factor, which obviously I have sacrificed this weekend for the Battle of Ideas. I just want you to note. But despite that, you know, it is this thing which is everybody, you know, people get cynical about it and say, oh, you know, they're trying to get votes by crying and everything. But there is this sense in which everyone does feel as though everything that has happened is the marker, right? It is, and everything's traumatic. And people will say, this is what happened to me. And what am I going to do about it? And the reason I was reacting to, jokingly at your expense to what you said is, I do think and I do worry that at the moment, my generation, are in danger of allowing younger generations to, in a way, get away with accusing us of causing the problems they're in, right? And I think the great thing about, you know, you are not scarred for life by the fact that a few people had a good time in the 60s, or even that you can't buy a house till you're 37, which doesn't seem to me to be the greatest traumatic experience historically thrown at a generation. And that anyway, that it's feasible that actually you can take things into your own hands and do something about it, rather than demanding that somebody does it for you, or that you can't overcome or transcend the problems. That seems to me to be a reasonable way of kind of approaching the future.
I'm not trying to say that you guys are all blamed, but just accept that your generation have left us with some problems that we haven't been educated to work out or know how to deal with those situations. That's what I was trying to say.
Okay, just in relation to you, I think the problem that you guys have got, I think we're of slightly different generations, can I just say, on the panel. But sorry for that. The problem that you guys have got is that part of the lesson of the 60s that people will now want to learn today is the problem of letting young people get on with it. Do you see what I mean? That's seen as part of the problem with the 60s. Whereas, you know, and that's why I think it's very important to break out of this whole notion of, you know, let's kind of learn from what we think about, you know, because there were good things and bad things about the 60s, like any kind of historical moment ever. And part of the good thing was people's ability to sort of experiment and think out of the box, and we need a bit more of that. Secondly, sort of to disagree with John again. You said something really interesting, John, about ideology. And I actually think a lot of this discussion is precisely because there is no ideology now. And so instead of a discussion around ideology, you end up in this discussion about collective memory, which I think is very disorientating for people, particularly people who lived through the periods that are now being, I mean, you described it well, I think, as everything's discussed in terms that are PC. You know, that's the only language that we're allowed to use. So you get this shift away from ideology to memory, and it's all very personalised. So we don't talk about the 60s often, we talk about the people associated with the 60s, which then people obviously take very personally, and it becomes a very divisive kind of mechanism. So I would much rather there was a discussion about ideology, or ideas at least, rather than this sort of messing with people's minds on a kind of collective level.
I just want to clarify that point. I'm not actually arguing for a backlash against the freedom of the 60s. On the contrary, I'm part of that generation too, and I went through all that, and I don't have any regrets about it as such. My problem is that culturally, it has actually sent a bit of disinformation out there, which is that this kind of freedom has the capacity to satisfy human beings, and the actual discovery in real life of people is that it doesn't. Now, and there's a question left in culture about that, which is not being addressed. And I think that younger people are actually picking up that question. And the tendency of young people, therefore, is to backlash against that in that way. And I'm sort of trying to say, well, actually, that's our fault, and we should have actually dealt with it, and we should have actually analysed that culture in public. And I think the lady in the front is actually right in that we do have a responsibility in that. But in relation to apology, I have no problem with apologies, and I don't even, like Tony Blair's apology on the famine, I think that some kind of acknowledgement of what actually happened, as opposed to the dissembling that had gone about our shared history, needed to be done. Now, I don't know if an apology by Tony Blair was the right thing to do, and I actually criticised the way it happened and all that. So, but I don't agree that, the point about apology, this is not about apologies. It's about the fact that you can't apologise for certain things. And that's why this instrument is very useful in this war that's going on, because you can't get beyond it. I mean, if the Pope was to come, there's a big spire in O'Connell Street in Dublin with a very pointy top on it. And if the Pope was to come to Ireland and sit on the top with his arse sticking down the top of the pipe and apologise from up there on TV, it still wouldn't be enough. I said, too little, too late. So you see, and he said, but my hole is sore. Well, sorry, it's too little, too late. You can't, and that's the usefulness of this. This is the usefulness of child abuse in this culture war.
One of the things that has struck me, of course, is that the 60s is used as a sort of portmanteau term. What you have to remember is that for a great many people, the 60s never happened. It permeated through in about the next 10, 12 years. But for instance, I can remember many mothers who would never have allowed their daughter to share a mixed flat. And that was in the late 60s. They would have been shocked to think that their daughter was living with a man that she wasn't married to. To have a child out of wedlock in middle-class families was still disgraceful. Now, all that's changed. The 60s came much later for an awful lot of people. So generalization is difficult. I mean, you were talking about, the legacy left to your generation. One of the things, of course, is student fees. Now, I actually happen to disapprove of student fees because I'm an old-fashioned liberal in that respect. But you have to remember that when the baby boomers, who are younger than I am, were at university, something like 10% of that age group were going to university. Now it's 50%. So the economics have changed. It's unpleasant. Again, not being able to buy houses. Well, it used to be normal not to be able to buy houses. It's a very brief period in our history when people were able to buy houses. I don't think you can blame your parents or your grandparents even for everything. And as Jenny said, you've got to work it out for yourselves, ducky.
The 60s certainly didn't make it to Sheffield, I can tell you that. Now, this session is about putting the past on trial, the uses, abuses of apologies and judging history. That's what we're talking about. And let's be clear, the point that I've been making, or make again, that apologies can be very necessary. A true apology, it's a sincere expression of contrition. And it can pave the way for atonement and reconciliation where that is still needed. So where it is still needed, what Brandt did in Warsaw at the Warsaw Ghetto was a true gesture. What I believe Chirac did in '95 was a true gesture in both instances where it was still needed. However, when these issues are no longer still needed, whereas you say, the gentleman over there said, everyone has made up their minds, like the issue I'm discussing around the First World War, then I'm suggesting it's a sentimental way of just making us feel better for things that, you know, have been righted if there were wrongs, and it's a sentimental and meaningless gesture. Or even worse, where the apology is not sincere, and where reconciliation and atonement has not happened, like Tadgit's non-apology for Srebrenica, or perhaps what I don't know enough about Australian politics to know the background to that, but it might be the same. There, apologies are actually frankly damaging and actually make the situation worse. So that's the issue we were here to talk about. When do you put the past on trial? When do you apologise? And what are the uses and abuses of it?
Can we thank our panel, please?